Disclaimer. Names and certain facts will be changed to protect the identities of the innocent involved in this story. To be completely honest, I became a corrections officer because I felt like I couldn't fit in anywhere else. Is that sad? Yes. Is it true? Well, when I made that decision, I truly felt that way. But after the story I'm going to tell you, I've decided to work harder to put myself in a better position in life. Anyways, this all happened last Monday, the only day of the week I worked overnight shifts. The entire prison was abuzz that day because just 8 hours earlier, a new prisoner was transferred there. Not just any prisoner, mind you, but a bona fide monster. Harrison Pelton was charged with 2 murders, though is suspected of nearly 25, 4 counts of kidnapping and torture, 8 counts of assaulting a police officer, and finally, a federal terrorism charge. By his mid-20s, Harrison had decided that his batshit insane ideas on how this universe works, with him at the center, literally, were sound enough to attract followers, and somehow he was correct. Over the next 15 years, Harrison and his group, they never officially named themselves, grew in numbers and bloodlust, striking out whenever people announced skepticism of Harrison's beliefs. This attitude boiled over in early 2019 when Harrison and his 14 followers kidnapped a professor and his 3 daughters after the professor had made incendiary comments about a paper Harrison published the year prior. It still isn't known exactly what happened, but when the police raided the abandoned farmhouse the group were staying in, they discovered the hell that Harrison put his captives through. The professor had been completely skinned, and his skin had somehow been stretched enough that it covered a good bit of a horse's stall. The daughters had been brutally mutilated, 2 of which somehow had their organs surgically altered to cause them unending pain, and the other 2 had multiple appendages severed and were used for various vile acts. The police were finally able to locate the farmhouse in March of 2019, after one of the daughters' phones had accidentally been turned on, resulting in a ping from a nearby cell tower. When the first few officers attempted to make arrests, they were met with armed resistance. So, a couple hours later, 17 more and better armed officers arrived and engaged in a firefight with the group. One of the officers on scene had been deployed in Afghanistan before, and he remarked that this battle was worse than anything he had experienced over there. Off the record, he told a journalist,
"One thing you will never be told about are the things that don't make sense. Mainly after we had overpowered them and arrested the survivors, the amount of spent ammo found in that barn did not match the rate of fire they had been using beforehand. That's something I've never been able to shake from my mind."
The firefight lasted 45 minutes, wherein 1 police officer had died, 8 were seriously injured, and 9 cultists had died, with the rest being arrested after, strangely, laying down their weapons, admitting defeat. For some fucking reason, Harrison hadn't been put into a supermax initially. This led to him somehow convincing 5 other prisoners to attempt an escape at their prison this past February. They nearly made it, but were stopped at the literal last second. This forced officials to smarten up, and after a legal battle, fought with paperwork, they finally came to the conclusion that he would be transferred to a supermax just 2 weeks ago. Unfortunately for me, due to a mixture of a paperwork fuck-up with iffy COVID regulations, Harrison had to be vacated from his previous prison by the 1st, but he couldn't arrive at the Supermax until the 3rd. So, being the closest prison to that Supermax, my great warden said he would take Harrison for a few days until he could be fully transferred. According to co-workers I've spoken to, the entire day leading up to Harrison's arrival, staff and prisoners were talking about him. A good bit of the chatter was about Harrison's looks. The guy is nearing his 40s and still could pass for 18, and a reputation of being extremely uncooperative with pushy people, which could describe 90% of both prisoners and corrections officers. Harrison arrived at my prison around 3 p.m. that day. The prisoners had just had their lunch, and various groups were starting to have recreation. Again, due to wonderful COVID regulations, we could not put Harris into isolation due to shitty timing. We had a big fight a few days before, so most of the rooms had been filled. And others just had prisoners moved out. But there has to be a wait time before a new prisoner is moved in there now. So, he was moved to the community cell block where our riskiest prisoners are housed. Of course, my block. From what I've been told, things went smoothly for the first few hours. Harrison was constantly bombarded by prisoners in his room, asking all kinds of questions, and some possibly trying to provoke him, but he just sat there on his bunk, completely silent. The prisoners were disappointed by not being able to play with him, so when the on-duty officers yelled at the other prisoners to leave the cell, they did so without complaint. It wasn't until my shift began, 7:30 p.m., that things started to break down. It started with a little argument over dinner. The 3 occupants of the cell to the right of Harrison's felt as though somehow he had been given a larger portion of food than anyone else. They started shouting at us, claiming we were going to treat the celebrity better than them. Then, after we didn't give them the response they wanted, they began berating Harrison, calling him a creep, a freak, and that he wasn't tough, just sick. Now, I was never told what it was, but Harrison had yell whispered an insult back to the 3 men, which caused them to jump from their table and storm Harrison's. Harrison jumped to his feet as well, and got in the faces of the other prisoners. I still remember the look of Harrison's eyes as he stared into theirs. He didn't really look angry. He looked hungry, like a predator that knew he had just caught some prey. Luckily for the officers on duty, the men never came to blows. After the stare down went on for a bit too long, both sides just decided to back off for some reason. The next 2 or so hours went all right. There were no more incidents, and the prisoners quietly went to their rooms at 9 for lights out. I was charged with direct observation from an upstairs room that night. About 20 minutes after the men went to bed, the overall block lights turned on, and then off, and then continued to do this in rapid succession for about 20 more seconds before stopping and leaving the lights on. I radioed down to an officer, asked them what was going on with the lights. According to the guys downstairs, nobody had been in eyeshot of the light switch for the past few minutes, but they did confirm that someone had switched the block lights on. About 40 minutes later, I began to feel strange. Even though nothing had really changed, I was suddenly filled with extreme anxiety. So much so that I continuously squirmed in my chair and kept looking around the room. It felt like I was being watched by some man-eating beast. Unfortunately, this feeling was a bit vindicated. after my fourth look around, when I saw something awful in the door's window. Standing on the other side of the only door to the observation room was what I could only describe as a misshapen face. Grayed skin, a right eye that sat nearly half an inch lower than the left, a bulbous chin, and a nose that almost perfectly resembled a pig's snout. Obviously, I have never seen this face before, so, with that classic fear hesitation coursing through my veins, I struggled to get out of my chair and move slowly toward the door. About halfway there, the face disappeared from the window. And when this happened, it felt like a light had been switched. Feeling strangely empowered, I sprinted out of the room's door and looked around. Unfortunately for me, there was nobody in the hallway where the room's door was located in, so I sprinted toward the hallway connected to the left. Now, I swear, I was only gone for about a minute and a half, so you can imagine the jump scare I got when I arrived at the second hallway, only to be met with a chorus of blood-curdling screams. I twisted around as fast as I could, trying to figure out where the screams were coming from, and when I realized that they were actually coming from inside the block, I ran back to my observation room, slammed down the alarm button, and headed back out so I could get into the block. The screams stopped as I sprinted down the stairs. Luckily, my fellow officers were quick, so a couple already had shields by the time I got to the block's entrance. We entered a few moments later, screaming at the prisoners to wake up, get on their cell's floor. One of the other officers demanded to know where the screaming was coming from. "Officer, I believe that was my neighbors," a voice I had heard on the news crooned. The cell to the left of Harrison screamed that it wasn't them. So the other officers and I ran to the one on the right. Even though it has been over a week since, I can still smell the copper coating the inside of my nose. I wasn't at the front of the line, so my heart jumped as I heard one of the officers scream and frantically tried to get the cell door open. Inside was what I can only describe as meat. There wasn't a single identifying feature inside that room. The floor, walls, and the ceiling were coated in blood, organs, and meat. Investigators allowed me to leave the prison once I had given my statement, and I don't intend on going back. I did get in contact with one of the two officers that were declared mentally competent to remain on the job, though. According to them, Harrison was forced into solitary, against codes, on a blanket accusation of unruliness. According to the officers who moved him, he couldn't stop smiling. As for the dead prisoners, the investigation was handed to an unnamed authority. Thankfully, Harrison was moved to a supermax prison, where he will remain for the rest of his life. And as for me, I don't intend on taking another step inside a prison.